In this video, I'm going to explain difference between a service and headless service in Kubernetes. If you are in a hurry and just want one-liner difference between two, then here is a one-liner difference between the two types of services in Kubernetes. So, what is a service? When a request comes to a service, it routes that request randomly to any single pod which are its members. Whereas in case of headless service, when a request comes to a headless service, it routes that request to all of its member pods or a specific pod. Okay, now let's delve into some details as what it means or what exactly is the difference between a pod and a service. Remember that pods are temporary, transient, or ephemeral. Pod is basically a logical wrapper entity for a container to execute on a Kubernetes cluster. Pods come and go, they don't live forever. And one very important point is that every new pod gets a new IP address upon its creation. So it's hard for an application to keep track of ever changing IP addresses of a pod. Instead of directly talking to pod, applications talk to the service in Kubernetes, which has a permanent IP address. Whenever a new pod is created, it registers with this service. So whenever an application request comes to the service randomly selects a single pod and routes that application request to that pod. In other words, service offers an abstraction on top of backing pods. In addition to this, service also offers load balancing among its backing pod. So whenever a new request comes in, either service distributes the load in a round robin fashion and keeps track of which pod has the most load. Okay, so that is what service is. Now let's see what is a headless service. Each connection to the service is forwarded to one randomly selected backing pod in case of a regular normal service. But if the client needs to connect to all of those pods, and what if the backing pods themselves need to each connect to all the other backing pods within the same cluster? Connecting through the service clearly isn't the way to do this. So then what is? For a client to connect to all pods, it needs to figure out the IP addresses of each individual pod. One option is to have the client call the Kubernetes API server and get the list of pods and their IP addresses through an API call. But because you should always strive to keep your application Kubernetes agnostic. So using the API server isn't a viable option. Luckily, Kubernetes allows clients to discover pod IPs through DNS lookups. Usually, when you perform a DNS lookup for a service, the DNS server returns a single IP, the service cluster's IP. But if you tell Kubernetes you don't need a cluster IP for your service, and you do this by setting the cluster IP field to none in the service specification, then the DNS server will return the pod IP instead of the single service IP. Instead of returning a single DNS A record, the DNS server will return multiple A records for the service, and, and each one of these DNS records will be pointing to the IP address of an individual pod backing the service at that moment. Clients can therefore do a simple DNS A record lookup and get the IPs of all the pods that are part of that service. The client can then use that information to connect to one, many, or all of those pods. Setting the cluster IP field in a service spec to none makes the service headless, as Kubernetes won't assign it a cluster IP through which clients would connect to the pods backing it. So that is pretty much the detail of headless services. So just to repeat the difference, in a normal regular service, you give the cluster IP address, but in the headless service, you set it to none. Now let's have a quick look at the actual Kubernetes manifest. So on the left hand side, we have the YAML manifest of a regular normal service, and on the right hand side, we have headless service. You see that in the left hand side for the normal regular service, we are just it's a simple service specification where we are defining on line number 6 the kind service. We are giving it the name regular service. In the spec section, we are giving it that the selector would be app colon web, so it means that whichever pod will have this label of app web, they will be acting as backing pods of this service. And in the port section, we are saying that okay, the protocol is TCP, the IP address of this service is 80. So all the ingress or incoming requests will be coming to this port 80 for this service, and that will be rerouted to the target port on containers to 8080. When it comes to headless service, everything remains the same. The only difference is that in the spec section, we are saying cluster IP is none. When we say cluster IP is none on line number 10, this makes this service a headless service. So whenever the request will come to this service, it will be rerouted to all of the pods which are acting as backing pods of this service. So this is what is the difference between a service and a headless service. I hope that was useful. If you have any questions or feedback, please put them in the comments. Thank you.